My name is Nicole Morin Scribner, and I'm a volunteer with the Biddeford Cultural and Heritage Center. Today is Thursday, March 16th, 2023, and I have the honor today of interviewing Jennie Aranovitch. First of all, did I pronounce that okay?
It's close enough. We say Aranovitch, but yeah, it's fine.
Okay, well, I know names are important and I try to get it correct. So, I usually like to start these interviews right at the beginning by asking you what year and where were you born?
Sure. I was born in 1977 right here in Biddeford at the old Weber Hospital.
Ah, okay.
Yep.
And so, the other place where I usually start is how did your family get to be in Biddeford?
So my mom, okay, so going back a little bit further, my great grandparents, Harry and Jennie Aranovitch, they emigrated from Belarus to Biddeford. My great grandfather actually spent some time in New York originally and didn't like it there. And he had a relative who either lived in Biddeford or had passed through Biddeford or something and wrote to him and said, Biddeford's a nice place, you'd like it here. So he came to Biddeford and he worked to raise, to save up some money to bring over my great grandmother and her oldest child, who was a year old at the time, Eva, who was my great aunt. And then they came over to Biddeford to join him. And so my family's been in the area for a long time. My mom grew up in Old Orchard Beach. I grew up in Saco, and I left the area for a couple years after I graduated from college. I went to DC for a couple years, and then when I came back, I bought a house in Saco, and then we kind of upgraded to a bigger house, and this is it here in Biddeford.
I neglected to say that we were conducting this interview at Jennie's home here in Biddeford. So thank you for giving us a little bit of history of how you got into this particular building. So that's really interesting about your great grandparents. They came from Belarus. Now you probably didn't get a chance to know them personally.
No, they had both passed before I was born.
Mm-hmm. Now, was your mother close to them? Did she
Yeah,
know
very
them?
close, because my mother was actually raised by them the first about 4 years of her life, because um, when my grandmother was pregnant with my mother, she had tuberculosis. And so after she had my mother, she went into a sanitarium for TB patients. My grandfather had been drafted into World War II, so my mom had nobody to look after her. So she ended up being raised by her grandparents, my great grandparents. So she maintained an exceptionally close relationship with them her whole life. She spent every weekend with them in Biddeford, at their hotel. Um, yeah.
At their hotel.
Yeah, they owned the Columbia Hotel in Biddeford.
Now, where was that?
It was on the corner where Main Water and, why am I blanking? Main Water and what is the other street? Is it Alfred?
Yes.
Yes, okay. It's that corner then.
So, like where the Puritan was, which is now Happy Dragon, that intersection?
No, maybe
No?
it's not Alfred. I'll have to, I'm so bad
So
with directions.
further down, closer to the bridge?
It's right, like you would be, if you were at the front door, you'd be facing the Great Wall, the factory.
Okay. Maybe it's like Pike Street or High Street.
High, I think it might be High.
Oh,
It might
okay.
be High. I can check it and I'll double check it for
Yeah,
you.
I don't know that I was familiar with the Columbia Hotel. I don't know that
Yeah,
I'd heard of it.
burned down in, uh, I can check the year, but I think it was the late 60s.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Now, did your mother share with you some information about your great grandparents' story in terms of did they ever go back to Belarus after they got
no,
here?
no, no. They were very happy to be out of there. My great grandfather had been conscripted into the Russian army, and I think he served like, I don't know. I know it was like more than 10 years that he was in there. Um, and it was not a good situation for Jewish men because they were really kind of considered the most disposable in the Russian army. You know, they were the ones usually sent to the front lines because if they died, who cared? Um, so he had done his time. I forget the number of years that was required at that particular time in history because it's changed over the years. But he was there for quite some time, and he actually learned Chinese because he was stationed in China for quite a while. He spoke, I think, 5 languages.
I can imagine that making that journey from there to, well, I know New York, you said, and then Biddeford must have been a big transit. Just getting here.
Oh, yeah, I'm sure. I can't even imagine. I mean, I don't know a whole lot about his journey over, but I do know that when he sent for my great grandmother and their daughter Eva, they had quite a harrowing journey because the baby got scarlet fever during the trip, and my great grandmother didn't have any money to pay the ship's doctor because she only had enough to to get herself, to get the ticket and get herself over and the baby over. And so the doctor said he was going to throw the baby overboard if she didn't pay. And so she somehow was able, through other Jews on the boat, some of whom could speak, she didn't speak a word of English, but some of them were, she could speak to them and then they could intervene on her behalf. And so they somehow got the ship's captain to intervene in the situation. And he said, no, we're not going to throw the baby overboard. But they spent the rest of the journey in quarantine.
Isn't that mind-boggling?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I'm here about to start a new job and I'm freaking out about change. And then I think about what they went through.
And even then, just the journey getting from Belarus, which is that show my ignorance here. Is that a distinct country or was it part of Russia at the time?
It was part of Russia at the time, yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
So just the overland journey to get to do the ocean crossing and back then on a ship and
right,
that took
who knows how long.
Yeah, it's quite the journey that they had to go through and like you said did not speak the language. So then growing up here, I guess I'll talk about your story. What was it like growing up here? Because you said you first started out in
Saco.
In Saco.
Yeah, when I was born, my parents lived on the ferry road in Saco. And when I was 2, that's when they moved to Summer Street, and my mom's still in that house. It was, I think, a good childhood overall growing up. I did very well in the Saco public school system. I had, a best friend who lived on the corner of Summer and Main Street, so we were, within walking distance of each other. We used to play all the time at the Burn School, either ride our bikes in the parking lot or play on the equipment that they have since taken down. But yeah, it was good.
Now, any special traditions that you had in your family?
Well, I mean, I guess because my father had been raised Catholic. As an adult, he was an atheist. but he had been raised Catholic. My mother had been raised Jewish, and so we often celebrated, both holidays. So I guess that was a little bit unique. The kind of the Christian holidays that we celebrated, we didn't attach any religious meaning to them. So Christmas was about Santa Claus. It had, I don't even know how old I was before I realized that it had a religious basis for other people. Same thing with Easter. It was a day that the Easter Bunny came, So I guess that was somewhat unique.
Mm-hmm. Now, how did you learn about your culture and your heritage?
Well, I think that, it was a unique situation, because all right, so everyone has 4 grandparents. My dad's parents were in Kansas. That's where he grew up. So I didn't have much contact with them. We didn't have the money to travel out there. They didn't have the money to travel here. I saw them once when I was an infant, which I obviously don't remember, and went back as a 10-year-old. And that was and my grandfather at that point was already dead. So even though I always knew that, his side of the family cared about us, they sent us, Christmas presents and birthday presents and all of that, it wasn't like they were a daily presence in our lives in the way that my mom's family was.
Mm-hmm.
And then my mother's family, she really didn't have much to do with them. She kind of just grew distant from her siblings. So really the only extended family that I had was my mother's father's family. And so I forget where I was going with this.
So in terms of how you learned about your heritage and your culture.
So that was all I knew of my family, was that side of the family. So I was, I guess, very steeped in knowledge about that side of the family and an emotional connection with that side of the family. And so even though we had these other things in the background, like, a non-religious Christmas and non-religious Easter, really that Jewish side of the family was all I knew.
Mm-hmm. Now, how did you feel different, with regards to being in amongst your friends? Did you have some traditions that were different that...
I was always the only Jewish student in my class.
Mm-hmm.
There were only 2 Jewish families in Saco. My older brother, his best friend was from the other Jewish family, the Finks. So I was the only Jewish kid in my class. So, it wasn't like I never felt weird or anything about it. It was kind of like a special thing because at Hanukkah time I would get to do a little presentation about what Hanukkah was and that sort of thing.
Now, one of the things that I often ask people is, what role did the church play in your family?
So it's interesting. The synagogue in Biddeford, by the 1970s, the membership had dwindled to such a small amount that, they all but shut the doors. They would open for the high holidays. They'd bring in a visiting rabbi from, I think usually Boston. But other than the high holidays, there was nothing going on there from the 70s and into the 80s. And so there was no Hebrew school. I desperately wanted to go to Hebrew school, but that would have required me going to Portland. And my mother, my parents had gotten divorced. My mother worked full time. There was no feasible way that it would work. But yeah, there was a big resurgence of the synagogue, but that wasn't until the 90s. So I kind of missed that window. Yeah. So I would say that, the way that I was brought up, we had a very strong cultural tie to Judaism, but not a strong religious tie.
Mm-hmm. Hmm. So, what is your father's last name? What is the background of your father's last name?
Oberzan. So he was Slovenian on his father's side, and his mother was part Irish and part Swedish.
And you said his parents were living in Kansas. How'd he end up in Biddeford?
Because of my mom. So he was the first in the family to, he was the oldest of the kids. But all of the kids actually, I believe, stayed in Kansas for college except for him. He was more adventurous and he went to Stanford. So he was out in California because he went to college there. My mom, after graduate school, she taught for a while in New York City and then decided to go out to San Francisco and see what that area of the country was like. And so they met in California. And my oldest brother was born there. But then, she eventually wanted to move back closer to her family. And so he got dragged along with her.
Well, one of the things that I do in preparation for these interviews is I have access to being able to look at newspaperarchives.com. So I was able to do some research, and I saw your mom was an active lady. I mean, going back from when she was in middle school and high school.
Oh yeah,
and
yep. She was a dancer her whole life. She was a cheerleader in high school. She I remember when I was little, she played tennis all the time. She was a runner, and then in her 40s, she got into bodybuilding. And that just totally took over her life.
That I thought that was interesting. I saw that she had her bachelor's degree and her master's degree, and then her career took a very different turn.
Yeah.
So, did she share with you what it was like from growing up in this area to where was she teaching? Did she teach in?
So she taught in New York. She taught in a very bad section of New York. I'm trying to think if it was at the Bronx or Harlem. I can't remember, but she had some crazy stories from that. And then she didn't teach again until after my parents got divorced. She of course had to go back to work, and she did a variety of things. One of the things she did was she was a teacher's aide in Old Orchard Beach, I think in the middle school.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And what prompted her making such a career change from a master's prepared teacher to bodybuilding?
Well, I think, she got into it because my oldest brother, as a teenager, got into it. And she saw the incredible changes in his body that he was able to make and how quickly he was able to do it. And she, of course, at the time was in her 40s and, starting to notice the signs of aging. And she thought, well, if it can make such a transformation in someone else, maybe I'll try this. So she did, and she just absolutely loved it. And she did see tremendous changes in her body, and was just so convinced that, this is what all women should be doing, especially, she kind of specialized in the middle-aged woman because there are so many benefits to women in terms of bone density by doing resistance training. So she's felt, has always felt ever since she got into it, really, really passionate. She's really passionate about it.
Mm. So focusing on you, because you're going to spend some time on you too. So tell me, what are some of your favorite memories from childhood?
Oh boy, definitely being at my great aunt Eva's apartment on Foss Street in Biddeford. She was the baby who had come over from Russia. She was like a second grandmother to me. She never married or had kids of her own. And so my brothers and I were like her grandchildren. So I have really, really fond memories of spending time with her. Also, my extended family would get together at the family's, they called it the cottage in Old Orchard Beach. It was actually the house that my mom grew up in, because my mom's parents didn't have much money, and so what they did is they lived in this house in Old Orchard that my great grandparents owned and used as the summer house. So they lived in a hotel during most of the year, and then spent a lot of time in Old Orchard in the summer. The house was not winterized, but my mom grew up on the second floor. They had like a big coal stove in the living room, and they would just use that to heat the apartment. So that's where she grew up, and then that stayed in the family until just a few years ago. It was sold, which was sad, but I have great memories of spending time there every summer of my life.
Was there anything in particular that you did with your Aunt Eva that made her so special?
Well, nothing that sounds too exciting, but to a kid, it was, we would go for walks to the corner store, and she would buy me, what they call it, like a hoodsie cup, the little cup of ice cream with a wooden spoon. That was a big deal to me. She would just read me stories. I liked to cook with her, even though we didn't really cook any, it was more like making toast with cottage cheese and warming up soup on the stove. That was cooking. And she had she had an alley kitchen and a big pull-out bin that I think was originally made probably for flour, but that's where she kept all her aprons. And so I would, go through the ritual of picking out which apron I wanted to wear. So yeah, we just had a lot of fun.
Now, did you have any special foods that are part of your family's traditions?
Well, I guess we always had some Jewish foods. I always joke that we were the only family that on Christmas ate chopped liver. That was like a Christmas tradition to have chopped liver with Ritz crackers.
That probably is unique.
Yeah, probably. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, other than that, Lakshan Kugel is another thing. My grandfather loved Lakshan Kugel, so when my mom would make it, she'd always make two and bring him one.
Can you tell me what that is?
Lakshan Kugel is the literal translation is noodle pudding. But so the best description I've ever heard of it from someone who's not Jewish was Bob Sear, actually. And he said, it's like a sweet lasagna. And that's like a really good description of it. It is. It's like a sweet lasagna.
So let's see. Let's think about your teenage years. You were where when you were a teenager? Where'd you go to school?
I was in Saco, so I went to Thornton Academy.
And special memories from there?
I was in drama. I think for not my freshman year, but sophomore, junior, senior years, I was in the drama club. Often got the lead roles in the plays. So that was something special. I worked extremely hard in high school. I really, really was very, very motivated. I mean, I had always been, but I guess it felt like it counted more in high school. I graduated second in my class. And I knew definitely by that point. I mean, I really think that I probably knew by middle school.
Okay, I think you were saying that you were second in your class when you graduated.
Yeah. And I knew from a pretty young age that I wanted to be an English major. It was very clear that that's where my interest and my talent was. Yeah.
Any special memories from high school other than working hard? What'd you do for fun?
Well, let's see. My freshman year, I was friends with some sophomores and seniors. And so I probably went out more my freshman year and did silly things than any of the other years of high school. Because after that, I really don't remember doing much of anything socially other than the hanging out one-on-one with my best friend. I was very focused on studies. I remember my 16th birthday. My mom put dolls in all the chairs of the dining room table because those were the only friends I had.
Huh. So let's see. Back then, Thornton, did you hang out or any interactions with the other local high schools?
No, because I mean, I didn't play sports. I got involved in weightlifting when I was 16, and so that was my sport, which was just an independent thing.
Mm-hmm.
So didn't have a lot of contact with other schools outside of the annual one act play festival that we would compete in. Yeah, in actually going back a little bit earlier in middle school. Actually, it started in 5th grade, my involvement in Odyssey of the Mind. So the gifted and talented class was called New Horizons back then. And so we participated in Odyssey of the Mind from 5th grade through middle school. And our 8th grade year, we made it to the world level competition.
And where did you go for that?
Of all places, it was held in Tennessee. Yeah, it was at the University of Tennessee. So that was a big highlight of my middle school years, I guess.
Now, had you ever been outside of Maine at that point? Had you traveled much?
I had gone to Kansas when I was 10. And other than that, no, I don't think I had been out of state.
Mm-hmm. Now, how did you decide what to do after high school?
So I knew I wanted to be an English major. And I had grown up listening to my mom's wonderful collection of stories of her life in college at Colby. And so I had this, special place in my heart for Colby just through all of her stories. And so that was one of the schools I was most interested in looking at. And when I went there to visit, it was so beautiful. The campus was just gorgeous. And I don't know, I felt like having grown up hearing about it so much, I almost had a little bit of a familiarity with it. And of course, it was an excellent school with an excellent reputation and a great English department. So that just became my first choice. And so I applied early decision.
And what's your favorite memory from going to Colby?
My favorite memory from Colby, I would say it's not really a specific memory, but I guess the thing that I'm most appreciative of my time at Colby was the education I got as an English major. I did not feel like I fit in at Colby socially, but academically it was a phenomenal place to be. My professors were incredible. My classes were incredible. I had no idea how good I had it at the time. And then, my junior year, I did abroad at Oxford. And that was a really neat experience. And I formed a couple of really good friendships. I had a very close relationship with the girl who I ended up rooming with my sophomore year. She ended up transferring to UPenn as I went off to Oxford. So our last 2 years we weren't together, but we're good friends to this day. She was Taiwanese and still lives in Taiwan. And then I made another really special friend during my year abroad, there were 3 students from Colby who who did the Oxford program. And one of the other Colby students, I didn't know her at Colby. I had met her at Oxford, even though we were both Colby students, and we became very close.
So was that a difficult transition to be in England?
Yeah, it was hard for me. It was tough for me because I'm very much an introvert, and there was a group of, I don't know, like 10 American students who were all there in the same college. And so we all kind of, traveled in a pack sort of, but I always felt like the outsider. I didn't quite feel like I was part of the group until maybe, midway through the year, the group kind of broke into smaller groups, and then I found my little niche area. But yeah, I don't like change. I'm not good at making friends. So the social stuff was tough for me. And academically, it was very different. The academic system there, you don't go to classes. You have tutors who you meet one-on-one with, either every week or every fortnight. And then you have the option of going to big lectures if you want. None of us Americans found it very helpful, so we tried it and then we just ditched the lectures. So really it just consisted of these one-on-one tutor sessions. So, you definitely missed the classroom dynamic and interaction. But on the other hand, you got a lot of one-on-one specialized attention. So,
Now, did you find life and the environment in England very different than what you were used to in our area?
yeah, I think so. Certainly, the culture was much more geared to walking around and not driving, which was nice. I ended up meeting a guy who I dated for pretty much the whole year I was there. I met him through the Jewish Student Society, which was called JSOC, and he was the president of it. And that was probably one of the best things that happened to me, because coming into, as his girlfriend, as the president's girlfriend, I kind of came in there with special status. But that community was the most warm, welcoming community. The Jewish community in England is fundamentally different from the Jewish community in America, I think. They were just extremely, I think, just from being European and having gone through what European Jews have gone through, they're a bit more tight-knit. And yeah, they immediately embraced me. So I felt like I had, even though it wasn't in my college, I felt like I did have that social network.
That's really interesting. And so it made it easier to find that community when you got there, to connect with that community.
Yeah, I mean, I went to one of the days where they had all the student organizations were tabling, and I put my name down, and so I found out when, I guess it was like the first Shabbos dinner was going to be, and it said something about, if you don't know how to get there, go to this college, someone will meet you and walk with you. So that's what I did, and ended up just talking. And I'm not a talker. I don't talk to people I don't know, but everyone was just so friendly. And one of the people I talked to happened to be this guy who ended up emailing me and asking me out. So
that worked out well.
Yeah.
At Colby, was there an easy transition to be able to continue with that side of your life?
No, I did not fit in socially at Colby. I felt pretty, I don't know. It felt like, I mean, this is an oversimplification, but it felt like the vast majority of kids there came from very privileged backgrounds. You know, their biggest problem in life was, you know, what color skis am I going to use on my trip? You know, it's just I didn't quite I couldn't click with them. Like I was from a different planet. And I was so focused in college that it didn't really bother me that much because I went to classes, I worked out, and I studied, and that's all I did. And I ate and I slept.
Now, what happened after college, and what was your direction there?
Yeah, so I always had it in my mind that I was going to get a master's degree in English. And I got into UPenn, which I think at the time their English graduate school was ranked like second in the nation. I also applied to go back to Oxford for my master's degree and didn't get in. But I got into UPenn, and so I started there, and I hated it. I was in the master's program, and I hated it with a passion. I think I was there for maybe 3 weeks. And when I say that I didn't know how good I had it at Colby, what I mean is that the teaching at Colby was phenomenal. And then to go to a big university where the professors are much more concerned with their own research than with teaching undergraduates, I didn't feel like there was no individual attention. The lectures were just boring. They didn't want you to think for yourself. They were more interested in you regurgitating theory that other people had written. That was the biggest difference. And I had one professor who was downright cruel. I remember I ran into the bathroom and cried because we were sitting around a table and she was asking for an opinion about something. And I said what I thought, which was an original thought. And she said, well, that's very undergraduate of you. Yeah. So it was just not my cup of tea. And I think I was there maybe 3 weeks or so. Maybe it was longer. I can't, but it wasn't too long. And I told my mom, I was like, I'm just not happy. And she said, come home. So I ditched that idea. And so I decided I'd look for a job. And that's when I found my first after college job, which was with a nonprofit organization on Capitol Hill called Americans United for Separation of Church and State. And so I took the position as the assistant to the executive director. My good friend from Colby, the one I had roomed with my sophomore year, she had already moved out to the DC area. She was living in Northern Virginia. And so I bought my first car, my Toyota Corolla, and I drove myself down there and moved in with her. And I was down in DC for 2 years.
Now, what was that transition like?
You know, it was fun, the work part. I loved where I worked, and I was with the best colleagues, and I loved working in a nonprofit and feeling like, you know, I was doing something for a good cause and a mission that I believed in. Had an absolute blast with my coworkers. Living in DC or the DC area was not my cup of tea. You know, it was just so crowded compared to Maine, and it took so long to get anywhere. And even in walking in a store, you'd be trapped behind 10 bodies walking at a snail's pace, and it would drive me crazy. People were rude. You know, you'd go to a grocery store and no one would say anything. Like, you'd go through the checkout line, and I remember thinking, what is happening? Nobody said thank you or have a nice day or anything like that. It was just nothing. So I knew that I didn't want to stay there, but it was a good place to kind of be in your early 20s, and, you know, it was a great work experience.
So what was the next chapter after that? How'd you make the decision to make a move?
So what happened is I met my first husband when I was in DC. And that was quite a story. It was bad. His parents did not approve of me. And so there was a lot of horrible, horrible stuff going on, a lot of tension. And we just knew that we needed to get out of there. So we literally kind of snuck away in the middle of the night. Like, we didn't tell, I mean, our workplaces knew, but like his family had no idea. They are from the DC area, and we just left without telling them. And we came up here. We had come up for a Thanksgiving break to stay with my mom. And while we were up here, we found a house and bought it. And then I think it was like January when we just left and we moved in. Yeah.
Now,
Yeah.
so you still managed to get yourself settled in this area?
Yep. So we settled, we bought a house in Saco on King Street. And I worked a little bit after we moved back. I worked for a little while at Preble Street Resource Center in Portland. I did that. But prior to that, I think I had signed up as a substitute teacher for a while. I did subbing. And at one point, I accepted a full-time position teaching English at Massabesic High School, and lasted 3 days maybe. That was a horrible experience. I was assigned classes that, these were high school kids, they were freshmen, and they were not the lowest level. They were one up from the lowest level, but they could barely read. And the behavior issues were they had no respect for me. I was this, short, petite, blonde woman who was young. And I mean, they would get right up in my face and scream and swear at me and throw things at me. And there was no assistance from administration. And I said, this isn't worth it. I'm not doing this. So, yeah.
So you found something better?
So I think it was after that I ended up getting the job at Preble Street. And did that for a little while. And then we knew we wanted to start a family. Preble Street was okay, but it wasn't, I didn't want to do that forever. So once we decided, I also knew that once we had a baby that I would be staying home. And so I ended up leaving before I got pregnant because I figured, well, what's 9 months? It'll give me time to take care of myself. So I quit that, got pregnant, and then had my son.
So tell me about your children.
My oldest is Josiah, and he is a freshman at Worcester Polytech Institute, majoring in data science. And then 3.5 years later, I had my daughter Eva. She's 15, and she's a sophomore at Biddeford High.
And I saw that she's been involved in Odyssey of the Mind as well.
Yeah. So it was funny. The year that I went to the World Finals, that was my 8th grade year, and then her 8th grade year, she went to the World Finals. So she's been there twice. Although I say there, but the first year was virtual because of COVID. So she did COVID World Finals, and then last year they made it to Worlds again, and she went to Iowa. And so now March 25th coming up is going to be the state competition, and then I'm pretty sure they'll make it to Worlds again, and this year it's going to be in Michigan.
Well, something that you mentioned is, I was going to bring it up later, but I might as well bring it up now, is the whole, how did you get through COVID, and what was that like for your kids too, going through COVID?
Yeah, it was tough with, the 4 of us were here in the house. I was working remotely. The kids had their classes remotely. So yeah, it was not an ideal situation, but I feel like when I compare it to, people who were working full time and had little kids who were trying to work while they had, toddlers and elementary school kids who they had to help with their homework. My kids were pretty self-sufficient at that point in their lives, so it wasn't a huge burden to me. I can't imagine going through it with young kids.
But it must have been a difference in terms of not being able to really socialize like you would, at that age.
Yeah, they did not like being online. They missed the uh, social interaction piece, definitely. I'm just grateful that, it hit when my kids, like I said, were at an age where they were self-sufficient, but also weren't, like, my son wasn't a senior yet. So it's not like his senior year got ruined. So yeah, we made it through. Work felt very weird at first, working from home, but then, after a while I got used to it, and then I love it. Could do my work in my pajamas.
Now, one of the things that I did see, which is a kind of a really cute little anecdote, is the contribution that your daughter made to Biddeford's Winterfest.
Oh yeah. Yeah, she designed the what do you call it? Mascot. Yeah, Francois. Yeah.
I thought that was really cute. I remember when I first saw it, I thought that was like the perfect mascot. And then in getting ready for this, and I'm like, oh, and look who designed it.
Yeah, she's very talented. She's really good in art. She does not get that from me.
So I don't know that so you had your children and then you went back to work at some point?
Yeah, so I got divorced when, let's see, Eva was, I went back to work when Eva was 3. Yeah. Yeah, and that's when I got my first job at UNE. I started off on the Portland campus as I just wanted to get my foot in the door somewhere, because here I was, a newly divorced mother of 2 young kids, and I had been out of the workforce for 7 years. So it wasn't like people were banging down my door. And I ended up, I was just grateful to get in anywhere, and it was just an administrative assistant position for the Center for Public Health at UNE. Was there for a year and a half, and then saw through the UNE announcements that there was a position open in the communications office. And honestly, at that point in time, I didn't really have a good sense of what communications was. But when I read the job description, it involved writing. So I remember sitting there thinking at my desk, this has always plagued me, just thinking, well, no, I'm not good enough to get that. But then something said, you should at least just try. And it wasn't for a high-level position. It was for communications assistant. And I don't know why I didn't think that I would be qualified for that, because I was overqualified for it. But anyway, I got that, and then it was in the communications department, ever since.
Now, what would you want to share about what people may not know that involves?
Communications? I think that communications is such a broad area. It involves so many things, everything from videography to web design to speech writing, article writing, it's very wide. And our department developed in a way that, we started off small, and we're at the point now where everyone's very much a specialist in what they do. And so I, really specialize in writing. And then there are, a couple of people who are more like the jack of all trades, but I'm not one of them. I'm very much in my specialty field. I guess people don't really realize just how much goes into the production of the different pieces that the department produces, whether it be a video, a marketing video, or some kind of print collateral, or a speech or whatever. Like it goes through so many different people adding their area of expertise to it.
Now, what did you enjoy the most about that role?
I am a huge grammar nerd, and I love grammar, and I love AP style. So I, I obviously do a lot of writing, but the other part of my job is editing and proofreading everything that gets created in the department. Anything that has words in it comes through me at some point. And I just really enjoy that kind of nitpicky work, I guess you'd say. My mother instilled in me impeccable grammar. She was the kind of mother who you'd take a note from the teacher home, and she would get her red pen and correct the teacher's writing and say, "Give this back to Mrs. So-and-so."
What did you find the most challenging in your role at UNE?
I don't know. It's hard for me to say because I grew so much with the role. I feel like there were challenges along the way, but I always grew and met them.
Now, one of the things that you mentioned that kind of triggers a question for me is communications now has so many different mediums, and it sounded like what you had focused on mostly had been the actual like reading and writing, obviously, and now there's a whole technical piece to it. I mean, you mentioned web design. What was the evolution of your skill base in those areas?
So I started off, like I said, as a communications assistant. They recognized fairly quickly that I was far more capable than what those job duties entailed. So within a short period of time, I was writing press releases. I was proofreading the UNE magazine. It wasn't until quite some time later that I broke into kind of the marketing side. And so then I started writing for the web, which was a whole different kind of writing, as well as like writing for brochures. But I always stayed away, and this was by design, I always stayed away from the technical side. So because I'm not a technology person, I hate technology. I didn't have a phone for the longest time until they made me get one. And I said, okay, if you're going to make me have one, you're going to pay for it. I dislike technology fiercely. So even when I write something that's going to be put up on the website, what you're going to get from me is just in a plain old Word document. Give it to someone else to do all that stuff with. Yeah.
Now, I in addition to all this work that you've done, something that you're known for is some of the research and the projects that you have been involved with, particularly with chronicling the history of the Jewish community in our area.
Yep.
So tell us about that. What prompted you to start working on that, and tell us about what that journey was like.
Yeah, so I guess it was probably in 2000, I don't know, 2004-ish, when it occurred to me that the 100th anniversary of the synagogue was coming up in 2006. And I thought, we can't let that go by without, making some kind of to-do about it. And so I was thinking about what could we do? Like what was fitting for the 100th anniversary? And then I don't know, I honestly can't remember how the idea of a museum exhibit came to me. But once I had that seed in my brain, I took it to the Strasslers, who then said, well, let's take this to the board. and Arnold Shapiro was the president of the synagogue at that time. And I was invited to come to a board meeting and, make a little presentation about what I was envisioning. And he asked me, how much money would you need? I don't know, I said $100 or maybe $200 or something like that. And they voted on it then and there. And Arnold slapped the table, which was the custom, that's a done deal. And there you go. So I spent, it was probably a year and a half, putting the word out to the community that I was doing this and that I was looking for all kinds of artifacts and, documents or anything that people had in their attics or whatever, and was able to amass quite a bit of stuff. Of course, a lot came from my own family because my family were kind of pack rats. My mom had inherited everything from her Aunt Eva, who had inherited everything from her parents. So I had quite a bit to work with there. And then members of the community, it was actually really kind of touching the way that, people trusted me with these very precious photos and, artifacts that they had without, a lot of them had never, they had never met me, but it was like, oh, you're Ivan's granddaughter, so I was immediately, okay, I can trust you. So we got the space at the Saco Museum, and I just kind of looked at the display spaces and kind of mapped out in my head what themes of the community that I wanted to highlight and where they would go, and just put it all together. And then we had an opening reception that took place at the museum, and we also did an open house, I think the next night at the synagogue, and Governor Baldacci came to that and some other dignitaries. Yeah.
That must have felt very rewarding.
It was. And I'm looking back, I can't believe I did it because Josiah was a 2-year-old at the time. And granted, I was a stay-at-home mom. I didn't have a job, outside of the house. But he was an extremely difficult baby and young child. Extremely difficult. I mean, I was tearing my hair out. So the fact that I was able to pull that off in that time of my life is quite extraordinary.
Now, is there anything that kind of jumps out at you as something that someone contributed or you discovered that is part of that collection that you went, wow?
One thing that my ex-husband did that was really helpful was he's has his master's in city planning, and so he was much more computer literate than I was and knew how to use all kinds of programs. And what he did was he really kind of helped me with the Jewish businesses theme of it, and he was able to kind of use maps to show where all the businesses were at such and such a year, and then how they declined, and how many dots on the map at this year, how many dots on the map at that year. So that was good, and he did a lot of research for me in the the city directories to get businesses.
Mm-hmm. Now, did you capture some stories or anyone come forward with things dealing with, it's like I don't know how to ask the question, but dealing with the Holocaust in terms of, people who were were there anyone that had actually, lived through it or had something that they were able to bring back from
No,
there?
I don't think so, because the vast majority of the Jewish immigrants to this area came at the turn of the century.
I see.
So they got out of Europe before the Holocaust. So there wasn't, there were certainly, a good percentage of the Jewish men here went off to fight in the war. But in terms of having any kind of personal experience with concentration camps or anything like that, no.
Mm-hmm. Now, you also have done, in addition to that collection that went into the museum, you've also gathered some additional history as well.
Yeah, well, I've never stopped, trying to amass the history. So that was kind of the first big project that I did um, regarding the history of the congregation, and then I essentially used that information to write a chapter of a book about the houses of worship in Saco that was published. Someone had reached out to me and asked me to do the chapter on the synagogue, and so I was able to kind of recycle the information that I had gotten for the exhibit to do that. And then I ended up doing a public Zoom presentation for Biddeford Cultural and Heritage Center. And then most recently, for the synagogue, I did a Zoom presentation called, what did we title it? Growing Up Jewish in Southern Maine, the Mid-Century Experience. So that was specifically looking at people who had grown up here in the 50s, who were kids and teenagers in the 1950s. And interviewing them and finding out what life was like for them and what they remember and all of that. And then we did a Zoom. It was a moderated discussion panel. Basically, that's what it was.
And from that work, any major takeaways that you would want to share that were either a surprise or that you want to make sure that other people know about?
I think and people commented on this who are part of the community today, but didn't have a long-standing relationship with the community. They're more newcomers. They said what was so apparent from that presentation was just how tight-knit and close the community was in the 50s. And I'm really glad that came through because that was really kind of, the 50s is when the Jewish community here peaked in number. It's when the Jewish businesses peaked in number in this area. It was really kind of the pinnacle, and then it was a big downhill slide from there. But the 50s and beyond, the community was really, really close and tight-knit. So I'm glad that we had the opportunity to get those people together, before it was too late, because they're, in their 80s, late 70s, early 80s now. And I'm glad that spirit kind of came through.
Now, how would you describe how the community is now?
Well, I would still say that Congregation Etz Chaim, for a modern, current day synagogue, is very tight knit. We're not a small group. We're not a large group. There's relatively few of us, and so that kind of almost automatically, I think, makes you a little bit closer. But the biggest difference is that in years gone by, people were still largely Orthodox. And because of that, because they were Orthodox, they had to be able to walk to the synagogue. And because you can't drive on the Sabbath. So because you had to walk to the synagogue, you were all physically close together. You all were generally in the same physical area. And I think that once that started breaking apart, there's no repairing that. You can never get back to that level of closeness.
And now in the congregation, it pulls from the greater area?
It's, all of York County, really. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So people are, spread out. We've got Saco Biddeford families. We've got Arundel families. It's people, Alfred, that people are all over the place. Kennebunk.
Mm-hmm. And I think that all of us immigrant groups, we have those challenges when it comes to um, passing it down to our children? How are your children involved with the community?
Yeah. My daughter, she is in teen class at the synagogue, which has been good. There's, only 4 of them in class, but this is her 3rd year, so this will be her last year. My kids both, started off in Hebrew school. They no longer offer it because they don't have enough kids. I would take them to Sunday school, which was more for like the little kids, a preschool age. My son, his senior year, he won the college scholarship that they offer. He and another girl co-won it. I definitely tried to keep them involved, and they're 5th generation, so definitely want them to grow up feeling that connection.
And I would think that it's a challenge where it continues to be such a target group. I wonder, how that feels when you see that.
You mean the anti-Semitism?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I almost feel it's an odd feeling because you read about escalating anti-Semitism, and I know that it's real and I know that it's out there. I guess we're just very fortunate here that we don't have to deal with it. It's a topic that they talk a lot about in my daughter's teen class, and she's always kind of arguing, well, it's not like that. It's not that she's denying that these things that are documented, like it's documented that anti-Semitism is on the rise, but it's kind of hard to square that when your own experience isn't showing that.
Is there anything that you would want to make sure that people understand about the Jewish community?
I guess, the biggest stereotype that persists is that Jews are all rich and that all they care about is money. And that's just, from my experience, so far from the truth.
Thank you for sharing that. Now, you said that you're not that fond of change, but you're just about ready to make a big change.
I am. Yeah. So I'm leaving UNE after 12 and a half years. Next Tuesday is my last day, and I'll be starting my new job on the 30th. And that will be with Achieving the Dream, which is a national nonprofit that's headquartered in Silver Spring, Maryland, in the DC area. And they work with community colleges and tribal colleges throughout the country to help break down the barriers that are faced by low-income minority students and first-generation students, to help them be better able to access higher ed and to succeed in higher ed.
And I think you said you'll be working
remotely. Yes, it's a 100% remote position.
So you don't have to go back to...
I do not have to go back to DC.
So let's see. One of the things that I often ask about is what your personal experience was in some major events, like where were you when the ice storm of 1998 happened?
Oh, the ice storm of 98. I must have been in England. Yeah.
So being 12 days without power didn't bother you?
No.
Yet?
No.
How about 9/11?
I remember I was in DC, so that was very scary.
Mm-hmm.
I was in my office, and I remember the office receptionist coming up and telling me what had happened. And then we ended up evacuating because we were right on Capitol Hill. So we evacuated, and I mean, really, most of DC had evacuated. Yeah, that was a very surreal experience. And I was in DC, and my brother was in New York City. So my mom had 2 kids in the target cities. Yeah.
Pretty scary. Now, coming back to Biddeford, what is your sense of the evolution of the community with what you've lived through?
So growing up in Saco, Biddeford had a reputation. Biddeford was scummy, it was the wrong side of the tracks. It was, all the poor people lived in Biddeford. It was kind of crazy, the things that we thought. But obviously, not that any of that was really true to begin with, but Biddeford has, gone through such a renaissance, and it's such a different place now than it was. So it's great to see that, the downtown being very much alive and all these restaurants and, the mills being converted and everything. It's a different place than it was.
And even UNE.
Yeah, UNE has grown incredibly, yeah.
So you started at the Portland campus, so you've seen a lot in your time at UNE. You've seen a lot of the buildings go up. And
Yeah, I was in the Portland campus for my first year and a half, and then when I joined communications, I was in Biddeford, which was another huge plus. And then I got moved back to Portland.
Now, is there anyone in particular that has influenced you in your development, whether it's professionally in your career or on a personal level? I know you mentioned you were really close to your aunt, but in terms of someone who influenced the direction that you took?
I would say my mom. So we were both English majors at Colby. She, I think, instilled in me a love of books from a very early age because she always read to me. And, I joked earlier about her correcting the teacher's grammar, but she was very instrumental in making me the writer that I am, because starting in high school, she would read every English paper that I wrote, and she would point out everything that I did wrong. She wouldn't, write my paper for me, but she would read it and then say, this is grammatically incorrect. Well, why? And then she'd explain it. And I said, well, that doesn't sound right. And she would say, I know it doesn't sound right. It's because you're so used to hearing people say it the wrong way. But she really, made me a much better writer and made me very attuned to things in grammar that most people are not attuned to. And it's becoming more and more rare to find people who know all of the rules.
And then I see that you have an interest in learning how to speak Yiddish. Yeah. That's going to be a challenge.
Yeah. I've been, for the past 2 years, trying to learn Yiddish on Duolingo, which is, I know, not like probably the greatest way to learn, but it's free and it's available. So that's what I've been doing. I grew up, like I said, my mom was raised by her great-grandparents for the first 4 years of her life. So she grew up basically being bilingual, English and Yiddish. Like they would talk to her in Yiddish and she would answer them either in English or a combination of English and Yiddish. But as she got older, she lost a lot of that. But of course, just phrases and certain words would always be peppered throughout her language. So I would hear these words and phrases growing up, and I always thought it was a really cool language and one that I wanted to learn. But, it's not like you can just go to your local community center and take a class in Yiddish. So I had really kind of, given up that I was ever going to be able to learn it. And then my daughter, who had, she kind of dabbled in Duolingo with a couple different languages just out of curiosity, just to learn a little bit. And she said, Mom, they've got a Yiddish course in Duolingo. It's in beta right now. It's not finalized, but they've got it. And so I didn't waste any time. I got right in there and started learning. And actually, just last week, the teen class, I went with the teen class on a field trip to the Yiddish Book Center in Amherst, Massachusetts, which was quite a schlep. That was like 3 hours away. But that was amazing. They've got they've rescued like over 1.5 million books that were printed in Yiddish. And I was able to get some textbooks as well as some books that were geared, are geared more for like, elementary school aged kids that I would actually be able to read, because I'm not that good yet. So I'm hoping that, once I'm through the Duolingo course, I'll have some other resources to go to.
Was there anything in particular that you were hoping to accomplish once you are more fluent in Yiddish?
Well, really, that's the goal, is just to become fluent in it. And I don't know that I ever will become fluent in it, but, it's hard to become fluent in a language that you can't speak to other people in. There's no one to talk to in Yiddish. But, I'd like to just become as good as I possibly can in it, with the goal that, if I'm a grandmother one day, I'll maybe be able to pass some of that on.
That's special. Now, a couple of things that I usually like to do to wrap this up is, first of all, is there something that you want to make sure that people take away from hearing your story?
Gosh. I don't think there's anything specific, no.
Okay, and then is there anything else that you had wanted to share that maybe didn't come up?
No.
Okay. Well, I thank you so much for taking this time
Thank
to
you.
share this story with you. It's certainly been very interesting.
Thank you very much.